Hi everyone, welcome to the Barnsley Heritage Connects talk today on the South Yorkshire Local Heritage List. My name's Sarah Cattell. I'm the Project Officer for the South Yorkshire Heritage List, and I'm working at the South Yorkshire Archaeology Service. So if you want to speak to me at any point, you can get me through there and have a chat with me about the Local Heritage List. But today's talk really is just about a little bit of background about what the Local Heritage List is, what we're doing, what we're trying to do, and also a little bit of information as to how you can nominate things for the Local Heritage List. We're really keen that people get involved and get nominating all their favourite historic places. So this hopefully will give you what you need to do so that you can get onto our website and be able to start nominating places. So we'll make a start. So the first thing that most people ask is, what is a local list? We have national lists, we have national listed buildings, we also have scheduled monuments, parks and gardens are registered nationally, but a local list is just slightly different. So I'll just give you a bit of background as to what a local list is. It is still a register of heritage assets, but unlike a national list, the local list covers all of them in one place. So rather than having to separate out listed buildings with scheduled monuments and parks and gardens, we put them all together. So the Local Heritage List is this register of these heritage assets that are valued by their community, by the people who live nearby them, but don't already have any kind of protection. So, for example, a local list will be able to flag up quite early in the planning system a place of interest. It won't necessarily be able to stop development onto that, but because we're flagging it up earlier in the process, it means that we're able to do a lot more to help protect that place through the planning system earlier on. So yeah, it's a really important thing for us to be able to have in South Yorkshire, because it means that we can highlight all of these different places that are really, really important to either different communities or different parts of the towns and the cities in the area. So it's really important for us to have, and it takes into account all of these assets and keeps them all together so that they can be looked at early on. So we'll move on. Just wait for the next slide. So why are we doing this in South Yorkshire? Well, there's a bit of background to the project, and it all comes from around about October 2019, before the world went mad. The government announced quite an ambitious project, an ambitious campaign to try and get local heritage listing onto the agenda for most local councils and local authorities. Local heritage listing up until that point had been a little bit of a patchy thing. It's not something new, it's been going for about 50 years, and it sort of came about quite soon after national listing, when they started to realise that actually some places were not necessarily nationally listable, but still very important locally. So it's been something that's been going on for all this time, but it's been a little bit different depending on which council you're looking at. So some councils have a fully operational local list. Other councils have certain things locally listed, and others have nothing at all. So when the government put together this campaign and this expression of interest, they wanted to know which councils and which local authorities were up for trying to get their local list, either if they had one, into some more of an easier order and get it open to more people, but also for those councils that didn't have one, be able to set one up. So South Yorkshire, through the South Yorkshire Archaeology Service, decided that we would put in an expression of interest for the whole of South Yorkshire, so that we could cover Barnsley, Rotherham, Doncaster and Sheffield as a whole place, as a sort of a county-wide plan. And thankfully we were successful. We got our funding, and hence this is why we're here now. So what we want to try and do is draw together all of those places that had already been identified. So for example, in Barnsley, this is the only place that has any already listed buildings as a result of the Elsecar Heritage Action Zone. So that's the start in Barnsley. In Sheffield and in Rotherham we had, in Sheffield and Doncaster we had registered parks and gardens, and we've got conservation areas across the whole county-wide area. So we've got little bits and pieces, but we wanted to join those up and actually expand on it more. And the big thing about this is that we're encouraging local people, local communities, the people who know these places best, to be able to nominate them, because it's your heritage, it's your history, and we want you to be able to reflect that and recognise what you feel is valuable and what you feel is distinctive about your own area. And then, as I said before, that will then be recognised as part of the planning system and will hopefully help to protect these heritage assets in the future. So, what is it that we're going to actually be doing, and how will the local list actually be created? Well, it's a fairly sort of easy process, sort of step-by-step process, but there's a few things that it's worth knowing. So the first thing to point out, and it's something that I will probably come back to quite a few times in this talk, is that nearly everything is going to be done through the Local Heritage List website. So I've put the website address on there for you. It's also on Facebook and Twitter, so you can have a look. But the whole point of the website is that it becomes this one-stop shop for everything to do with the South Yorkshire Local Heritage List. So if you want any more information, or if you want a bit of advice about how to go about nominating somewhere, or if you want a little bit more information as to what's actually been nominated, or if you want to view the actual list itself and those things that we already have on it, it's all there on the website for you to have a look at. So it's worth going over and see what you can find. There's lots of information on there for everyone to look at. So everything will be done in relation to the website. Then what we'll do is we'll take nominations, and we already have started to take nominations from local people for their heritage assets that they would like to nominate for the Local Heritage List. So this could be any kind of historic place. So I'll get into exactly what constitutes a heritage asset in a moment. But they can be nominated all through the website. It's just a case of going on, registering as a user, and then you can put your nomination together. The way we're going to work the actual assessment and the deciding which things should be going on to the Local Heritage List and which things are not appropriate is we're going to be using 7 different criteria that are actually based on English heritage, well, Historic England's criteria for local heritage listing. And they are age, rarity, historical and community interest, architectural and artistic interest, archaeological interest, group value, and landmark status. So those criteria just look at the various assets and how they match with those criteria and how important they are to the local area. And so each criteria is very slightly different for each asset type, because obviously the age of a building and the age of an archaeological site aren't always necessarily comparable. So we'll be looking at these criteria that have been slightly tweaked so that they're particularly relevant to South Yorkshire. And they will be being looked at by a panel of local heritage experts. So on the panel are people like building experts, archaeological experts, we have conservation officers from our 4 local authorities, and we also have a representative from the South Yorkshire Archaeology Service. And that way we have this wealth of experience and expertise and local knowledge that can be able to look at all the nominations and work out which ones are appropriate to go on the local heritage list. So it's really important that that panel can get as much information as possible, because they'll be the ones making the decision to recommend it to the local councils. So, as I say, they'll be recommending to the local councils what assets they feel are appropriate to go on the local heritage list. So they're not the final stage in the process. Although thankfully in Barnsley, because the process has already been arranged and agreed with the council to have a local heritage list, and because of the work that was done in the Elsecar Heritage Action Zone, it means that actually Barnsley's process for doing this is a lot more straightforward. So it's just a case of the heritage asset being assessed by the panel and then informing the local council, and they will then put it onto their local heritage list. So it's all fairly straightforward, and it just means that at every stage you can see how the criteria have been applied and why certain things have gone onto the local heritage list, if you want to know any more information. So now we know how it's going to be created, we'll look at exactly what a heritage asset is. So I've mentioned this word a few times, and it can be a bit of an odd one to decide. So a heritage asset, we've got a quote there on screen. This is from the Historic England Guidance. It's a building, monument, site, place, area or landscape as identified as having a degree of significance. So basically what that means is anywhere historic, anything that you feel has got some sort of connection to a historic person or place, or has some significance in the heritage landscape of the area. So that can be anything. And as you can see, I've put some pictures on screen there of different examples of what constitutes a heritage asset. But in terms of the local heritage list, what we're doing is breaking them down into 5 categories. So we've got buildings and structures. That can be things like houses. It can be things like towers, clock towers. It could be things like some sort of monument, although monuments do come up later on, which I'll explain a little bit more about in a minute. But anything which is a built structure, not necessarily just a building. Then we have archaeological sites. So they're pretty much as you would expect. Any site that contains archaeological remains of any kind, whether it's been excavated and whether it's visible or whether it's still buried below the ground. We also have parks and gardens and designed landscapes. So that's parks and gardens in the conventional sense, but it also includes things like cemeteries and industrial landscapes, possibly, that have been designed with a consistent design to them. We also have commemorative monuments. So I mentioned monuments in relation to the buildings and the structures, but actually we have a bit of a distinction between our monuments. So for example, a prehistoric barrow would be a building or structure, whereas a war memorial would be a commemorative monument because it commemorates a particular thing. So commemorative monuments don't necessarily just have to be war memorials. They can be statues to certain people. They can be commemorations of particular events or a particular place. But something which commemorates something else, whether it be a person or an event or a time in history. And then the final category we have, which is area/places, is a little bit more difficult to define and a little bit more unusual, I suppose you might call it. So an area or a place is something which has heritage significance, but doesn't necessarily have standing remains or anything that you can see, or may incorporate a larger group of heritage assets. So, for example, we've had a nomination in from Sheffield for a river valley, which has an awful lot of water-powered sites all the way along it. So we've got lots of different heritage assets, but they're actually all together part of the same thing and all part of the same designed plan for that area. So that's been put together as a heritage area. So that will be assessed as an area. Alternatively, a place might be somewhere that is perhaps significant to the history of a village or for a town, something like a poet's corner or a speaker's corner, something like that. Maybe the field where the village fete is held every year, something which has a significance and has historic relevance as well to a particular community. So that would be classed as an area or a place. So pretty much these categories cover almost any historic asset that you can imagine. And we can work out which one. If you're not sure when you come to nominate, or you're not sure when you come to look at the list, what the asset you're thinking of falls into, you can always give us a shout and we'll be able to help you out. So that's what the assets are. We'll move on then to decide what actually we're going to do about nominating them and how to go about that. So as I said, one of the big things about this project is we want people to nominate these places that are important to them. Because at SciAS we're running the project, we do have an understanding of what historical interest there is across South Yorkshire, but actually what we don't have is that local knowledge and that local passion and that local interest. So we want you to nominate the places that are important to you across Barnsley and across South Yorkshire, in fact, because you have that local knowledge. You know how your community feels about a place, and you know how important a place is to the development and the history of your local community. So it's really important that these nominations come from you and come with that passion that you probably have for all of those historic places that you know well. So nominating an asset is fairly straightforward. There's sort of 5 basic steps which I'll go through just to give you a bit of an overview as to how to do it. And that way, hopefully, this will make the nomination form on the website a little bit easier to fill in, and it'll give you a bit of an idea as to how to go about this. So before we start, the one thing that does need mentioning is that in order to nominate an asset for the local heritage list, what you're going to need to do is register as a user on the website. So on the website, there's lots of information, as I said before, but there's also a section on how-to guides. So we've got quite a lot of how-to guides, which again, I'll mention again later. But there is one of those on registering to use the website. It's just a case of popping your name and your email address and a username that you want to use. And then that way you'll be able to not only nominate an asset, but you'll be able to comment on other ones. You'll be able to have conversations in the forum, and you'll be able to get the most use out of the website. You can still view lots of things without registering, but unfortunately you can't make comments and actually nominate anything. So the first thing to do is register on the website, and you'll be able to make use of it. So we'll move on to research and go on to our next slide. So the most important thing about nominating a heritage asset is the research aspect, because in order for us to be able to pass it on to the assessment panel so that they can assess it and recommend it for addition onto the local heritage list, they need to know a bit about the asset, whatever it might be. So that's where we need lots of information. So it's really important, and I think this is probably going to be the most fun bit as well for nominating. It's really important to find out as much as you can about the heritage asset that you're thinking of nominating. Now, it might be quite an easy job if you're a regular user of a particular building, or if you are part of a friends group for a park, for example. You might already know all of this stuff, and you might already have all of this information at your fingertips. But if it's somewhere that you perhaps pass every day on your way to work, or you've just seen and think that's really nice, really important, it needs to be protected, then you might need to do a little bit more work. So it's really important, the research aspect, and as I say, probably the most fun bit. And there are loads of places that you can go to get information on heritage assets. So the first one, and the one that I think most people will start with, and is probably the best, easiest place to start, is with historic mapping. So there are maps available either in your local heritage library, or alternatively, you can get those online as well. So there's lots of places you can have a look at old maps, and sometimes they can take you back quite a long way. Depending on what maps are held in your local heritage library, you could well be able to go back past the beginning of Ordnance Survey and go on to older maps as well, which can be useful. As I say, maps are available online, but it's not just maps that are available online. There's an awful lot of online sources, whether you want to get online information about your asset particularly, but you can also go online and get lots of information in general about your asset type. So, for example, if you've decided that you want to nominate a Methodist chapel, there's a lot of information on nonconformist places of worship, particularly on Historic England's website, but in other places as well. So you'll be able to find out about the type of the asset as well, whether your asset is slightly different or whether it's a good example of that. So it's always worth having a look online, not just about the information about your asset specifically, but also about that type of asset. But as I say, getting the specific information is also really, really important. Now, there's lots of places, as I say, that you can go online, but obviously I'm not going to reel them all off now. The best thing to do is go onto the website and go to the how-to section. It's as part of getting involved on the website. So if you have a look at that, you'll be able to find a help sheet on how to research heritage assets, and that's got links to all sorts of places that can be very, very useful in terms of research. So it's worth having a look at that, and it's the sort of thing you can download. You can put it on your phone while you're going out doing your research. You can take it with you to the local heritage library and see what sort of things you need. So it's a really handy little guide for it being able to help you out there, but it's also good to have all the links for the online sources. As I say, there's local heritage libraries as well, and they can be really, really useful, not just for the general history of a particular heritage asset, but actually they might have things like building plans or correspondence between owners or between users of a particular place. You might find information on trade directories or census returns that relate to owners of particular buildings or particular areas. So it's always worth having a look to see what the local heritage library's got in them. And often they have quite a lot of curveballs, a lot of slightly different bits of information that are really interesting and can be really helpful to actually illustrate how much your asset is important to the local community or how much it stands out and is distinctive. So it's always worth going and having a good rummage through your local heritage library and seeing what you can find in there. So once you've done all of your research, you move on to the presentation side of it. So when you get onto the website and you have a look at the nomination form is split up into two different ways of being able to present your research. So the first place is the description part of the form, and then there's also a statement of significance section to the form. So the description part of the form is where you can include some general information and some of the general facts that you found out as part of your research, whereas the statement of significance actually asks you to break that research down into the different criteria and how it applies to those criteria. So, for example, if you're looking at a building and you feel that the criteria of historic interest, archaeological interest, architectural interest and group value, for example, are important, you would click those boxes on the website, and then you'd be able to write in a little bit of information, the product of your research, that actually shows how that criteria is applied by that building or whatever heritage asset you decide to put in. One of the things that's really important to point out at this stage when you're filling in the form and when you're putting in your research is that because the assessment panel are working on the basis that we need at least 5 of the criteria to be met to either a greater or lesser degree, we need you to make sure that you've filled in at least 5 of those statements of significance boxes. So have a little think about your assets, have a think about how it applies to all of the criteria. You might think, oh, well, it's a building, so it won't apply to the archaeological criteria, but that's not necessarily the case. If your building has some original building fabric in it, or if it has some way that it can give us an inclination about how it came to be, how it applies to the local area, that sort of thing, we'll be able to use that then to say, well, actually, not only does it have historic significance, but it can actually tell us about the lives of the people who use this building. Therefore, it has archaeological significance as well. So it's always worth making sure that you have a really good think about how your research can be applied to all of the criteria. And as I say, the sort of the thing to remember about presenting it in that statement of significance section is please make sure you fill in at least 5 boxes, and then that way it's got a much better chance of going through to be locally listed. So those are the 2 ways of presenting your information. As I say, it's always worth thinking about the criteria when you're researching, but also when you're presenting it, because that's what the assessment panel will be looking for. They'll be looking for finding out exactly how it meets the criteria. And I've just put at the bottom here, relevant, not rambling. So the thing with researching any kind of heritage asset is it's fascinating. It's so interesting and you find out so much information. But actually some of that information may not necessarily be relevant to the criteria that we're looking at for local heritage listing. And whilst it's very, very interesting, we want to make sure that that kind of information is kept to the description section of the nomination form, so that when the assessment panel come to assess it, they can look at the statement of significance and they can just see exactly how each one is met without the extra information as well. So try not to ramble in the statement of significance box, because certainly up until this point, we've had so many nominations that it's actually quite difficult to get through if we can't find the information easier. But because all the information that you find and that you include on your nomination form will be included on the subsequent locally listed asset page when it actually goes onto the website, it's really important to have that information, but it's better to have it in the description rather than statement of significance, because that's the bit that people will probably read most when it comes to be locally listed. So that's research and presentation. What do we do next? Well, photographs. Another good way of really showing the character of your asset is to take photographs. So it might well be modern photographs of what the asset looks like now, but it can also include older photographs as well. So you might have pictures of it from 20, 30, 40, 50 years ago, possibly even older. So it's always good to have a bit of a mixture of different photographs from different ages, different eras, if you can get them. If you can't and you can just get a photograph of it now, that's just as important as well. So it's always good to include a photograph. And there's a few tips and things that you can use when including your photographs. So one of the first things to mention is take more photographs than you need. So if you're going to go out and photograph your asset from scratch and start from the beginning, take lots of different shots. So you might think, oh, well, I'll probably only need to use 3 or 4 photographs on the website. But actually, while you're out there taking the pictures, you might spot something that's slightly more interesting, or you might not be sure about a different shot. So if you can take a few more, it means you can get a good choice of photographs to depict your asset when you get back on and start putting it on the nomination form. And it's always good as well to get a mixture, whether it's an internal view or it might be a general view of the asset, plus photographs of perhaps details, particular interesting details. You might have a landscape that you're photographing that has some interesting points to it. So you might want to take some detailed photographs of those interesting points, as well as a general view of the landscape. So it's always good to get a little bit of a mixture of both, because again, that will be really, really interesting for people looking at the nomination form when it's finally locally listed, but also it will also help the assessment panel to be able to make their decision as well. The one thing to bear in mind is that you do get limited uploads on the website, so you can only include 20 uploads of photographs or other things. So it's worth having a think about the ones that really show the character of your building best or the character of your asset best. So think about what's in your photograph and how well it shows off your asset. So I mentioned the uploads being not just photographs. You can also use other supporting information. So I mentioned before about the interesting things that you might find in your local heritage library. Things like old documents relating to the asset. If you've got plans, floor plans, or you might have information about construction. You might have information about the setting out of a park or a garden. You might have information about an archaeological site. Things like reports or plans of the archaeological excavations if you're looking at an archaeological site. So all of those things can be included as well. And to be honest, the more information, the better, because this will give the assessment panel a much better idea of the character of the asset, the age, and some more of the information. But it'll also give the people who look at it ultimately when it's locally listed that bit more information as well, that they'll be able to find out about your asset. So include anything you feel is relevant and anything you feel is important to know about your asset. And providing you've got the permission to use it, it can all be uploaded onto the website. So I mention this because one of the things that we do have to remember for uploading onto the website is you must either own the copyright to whatever it is that you upload, or alternatively have permission to use it. Just because once it goes onto the website, it's there as an open source thing. So we need to make sure that the copyright is clear. But it's just a case of asking permission at the local heritage library or from wherever you get your image from. So it's not too onerous a task. You just need to tick that box. So once you've got your photos, once you've got your supporting information or all of your research, you can then move on to submitting your nomination. So submission is a fairly straightforward thing, but one thing I would say is don't submit it straight away. Once you've finished filling in the form, give yourself a day or two just to make sure that you've got all the information you want, just in case you have a sudden flash of inspiration that you want to include. So maybe give it a couple of days. You can always come back and add to the form before you submit it. So once you initially start your nomination form and start putting in your information, if you get a little bit more the day after or a few days later, you can always go back onto the form and add that stuff in. And again, providing it's under the 20 upload limit, you can always add other photographs, other documents, other scans, that sort of thing as well. So feel free to give yourself a bit of time to check it over and make sure that you're happy with everything that's there. Make sure that you're happy with it, the way it's been presented, and that it really says what you want it to say about your heritage asset, because you can always go back to it. The other thing to bear in mind is that whilst you're going through that process, nobody else can see your nomination form. So I, as the website kind of publisher, I suppose you might call me, won't be able to see what you're putting in. So you can still add to it and tweak it and change it as necessary. But once you've submitted your asset, I'll be able to see it. And the reason I mention this is, and it's come up a couple of times so far, is that actually some assets are so popular, more than one person actually nominates them. So what we do in that case is that we'll get in touch with you and we'll say, thank you very much for your nomination. Please, can we amalgamate it with somebody else's? So if it turns out that your nominated asset has been so popular that it's been nominated more than once, we'll put all of the nominations together and give it that more extra information to sort of put into one big nomination form. So we will get in touch with you if that's the case. Otherwise, your nomination will then go on. It'll be able to be viewed by the assessment panel so they can have a look at it as well. But it'll also go to a public consultation phase. What we want to make sure is that we've got as much information as possible. So you might find that there's somebody who knows all about your asset but hasn't necessarily come forward and may have some comments that they can make or some extra information that they could submit that will strengthen that nomination. So that's why we have the public consultation phase. And then anybody who's interested in the asset will be able to find out what's been said about it and give their opinions and their comments. Very often it'll say things like, yes, definitely this should go through. And obviously that's something that can be taken into account by the local Heritage List Assessment Panel. So they'll be able to see the strength of feeling and the strength of interest in that nomination. So once it's there on the website, as I said before, it will then go towards the assessment panel to be looked at and then ultimately hopefully recommended to the local council. But if it turns out that your asset doesn't quite make it onto the local list, if the assessment panel feel it's either not appropriate or doesn't have enough information, we may get back in touch with you and just say, can you give us a little bit more information about your asset? Can you extend this information a little bit more? You're always welcome to be resubmitting your nominations if you've got more information to add. So don't think that once you press submit, that's the absolute end of it. And if it doesn't get onto the list this time, that's the end. It's not at all. If you can put some more information in, if you can give us some more facts and figures or photographs or whatever, we will always relook at things. So obviously if a nomination is clear that it's got a lot of interest in it or there's a lot of community interest in it, we will try our best and see what we can do and see if we can get enough information. However, even if that doesn't work out and your nomination doesn't quite make it onto the local heritage list, don't worry. Your research and your time spent will not be wasted, because even those assets that haven't made it onto the local heritage list, that haven't necessarily quite met the criteria, will still be of interest to the historic environment record for South Yorkshire. So that's a record that's held at South Yorkshire Archaeology Service, and it pretty much is as it sounds. It's a full record of the whole historic environment of South Yorkshire. So we will add to that with whatever research you've given us, so that maybe even though it's not on the local heritage list, it can still be consulted, it can still be viewed as part of the historic environment record, and it will then spread the word of that particular asset far and wide. People will be able to find out about it still, and your research will still be really, really useful to us. So don't worry, no research is ever wasted. It's all valid. So now we know how to put the nomination form in. There's a few questions that people tend to ask. So we'll move on to the big one, I suppose. How long will it all take? A few people have sort of said to me, oh my word, what do we do? How long does it take? How long should it take? So first thing is, don't panic about it. It can take as long as it needs to take until you're ready for it and you're happy with it. So think about the research that you need to do. As I said before, if it's somewhere that you know really, really well, you might not necessarily need to do a great deal of research. You might only need to find a few facts and figures out, and that'll be you. It might be, if you don't know the asset so well, you just really like it, that actually you need a little bit more research. So plan your research, think about what you need to find out, where you might need to visit to get that information from, how long it might take you to look online, that sort of thing, and decide how long that will take you. As I said before, it's also important to give yourself time to check over your nomination as well and make sure it's got everything that you want it to have in it. However, if it does get to the point where you've pressed submit and you suddenly find out some more information, you can always email us at South Yorkshire Archaeology Service, and we can always revert that back so you can open it up again for editing and you can add more bits and bobs in. So don't panic if you've forgotten something and you can't do anything about it. You can always get in touch with us and we can help out. To give you a bit of an idea, though, of timescale, our trial assessment panel has been meeting in January. We've had quite a few to get through on our first sort of trial of the assessments. So we've had a few meetings, and so we've met throughout January. And we're hoping that the approval and the adoption process will be happening in the next couple of months. But we will be having more assessment panel meetings. So if you've not got any nominations in just yet, don't panic. It's not a one shot and you're out. We'll be doing this quite regularly, and we're hoping that we can carry on sort of steadily assessing local heritage list nominations for a while to come. So there will be another opportunity. We've put out to consultation, so we'll always have a month to put out to consultation for people to be able to make comments on the nominations. So if it doesn't get in this time round, it can always get into the next time round afterwards. So don't panic too much about that if you've missed the January deadline. It's not the end of the world. There will be another chance. So that gives you an idea of how long it'll all take. It's a fairly straightforward process, but if at any point you find that it's getting a bit difficult, or you're not quite sure, a particular question about particular criteria, you can always get in touch with us. So you've just seen on the screen there came up our Twitter account, so you're very welcome to come and use that and ask us questions on there. You can also contact us via the website as well. So we have a contact form on the website, or alternatively you can email us at South Yorkshire Archaeology Service. We've got a general email box, which is on the website as well, so you'll be able to find it. So you can always get in touch with us and ask any questions if you're not quite sure, or if you need a bit of help. Similarly, if you're working in a group, it can be sometimes quite a nice thing to do in a small group of people. You might have somebody who's in charge of taking photographs, or somebody in charge of research, or somebody to actually put the nomination form online. So it can work quite well as a little group as well, or you can do it as an individual, whichever works better for you. The important thing is it's coming from you. It's coming from the people who actually live and work and know these places really, really well. So that's the important thing, and that's what we really, really want. We want you to be involved in the protection of your own heritage. So I'll leave it there for now. I'll let you go off and have a look at the website. You can find out what it's all about a little bit more on there. You'll be able to work out the nomination form, have a little play with it. But as I say, if you have any questions or you want any more information, do get in touch with us at South Yorkshire Archaeology Service, and we'll be able to help out in any way that we can. But for now, I'll say thank you very much. Thanks for joining us today on Facebook. This will also be available on YouTube as well afterwards, so you can always come back and watch again if you need to find out a little bit more information or relook at any of it, or if you've not managed to make it live. So you'll be able to have a look at it on YouTube as well. So for the time being, thank you very much. Happy nominating, and let us know how you get on.